r/NoSleep. Posted by u/rydenanne. The reason I hate cruise ships and the girl I never forgot. There were many things I disliked about my summers growing up. Mom and Dad seemed to have a direct connection to some reserve of wanderlust that motivated them to constantly be on the move every free moment they got. Being an only child with not much else in the way of family, I was dragged along on every trip. Every world's largest whatever, mule ride down the Grand Canyon, or month-long cruise that caught their eye, I'd have to go along. One of many annoyances that came with these trips was a lack of self-entertainment. I mean, this was the mid-80s. Nintendo hadn't released the Game Boy yet, and even if they had, there's no way Mom and Dad would have ever let me have one. They didn't even like television. Nothing new to be discovered on a screen that can't be explored in the real world. Dad would often say, Mom nodding along with him. This almost never failed to produce an irritated sigh or eye roll from little me. It wasn't until the cruise trip when I was 11 that they finally stopped pressuring me into tagging along on every trip. At the time, I had already become pretty independent, even to the point where I'd be allowed to wander a little on my own anytime we'd port. Perhaps, in retrospect, allowing me to do so wasn't the wisest choice. I never paid attention to the important details, even when my parents expressed how important it was to know these things. Almost never did I know where we were actually porting. Couldn't remember the actual name of cruise line we'd taken, even. So, surprising to no one, I was eventually accidentally left behind at port. The first thing I did was, understandably, freak out when I saw the entire ship was gone. Tears streaked my suntanned face as I walked around and desperately looked for anything I recognized. It seemed like hours, though probably more like minutes, before my eyes eventually landed on a familiar uniform. It wasn't the same cruise line as the one we were currently taking, but, instead, of one we'd taken in the past. She was suntanned as well, likely from a summer spent on deck smiling nicely at often rude seafaring vacationers. She wore a cropped version of the uniform tee with high denim shorts. I lightly tapped on her arm. "Oh. Hey there, Bean Sprout. Are you lost?" She greeted me with a warm grin on her face that instantly made me feel safe. That small comfort pushed me to tears again as I nodded and tried to explain through catch gasps that I'd been left behind. Her name was Josie. I'll never forget that. This girl, this sweet and incredible girl, could have rolled her eyes. She could have given attitude or pawned the problem off on someone else, but she didn't. Instead, she walked me around the port for an hour before getting in touch with the proper authorities. They, on the other hand, did not have much help to offer, as they basically suggested that either I fly to the next port to meet with my parents or one of the next ships going in the same direction would take us. Besides that, they radioed the cruise ship who eventually got Mom and Dad on. More than anything, they seemed a little irritated with both offered solutions, as either one would likely cut our vacation short. Still, without very much thought, they suggested I hop on whatever cruise ship would bring me next, and, if we were lucky, we could still continue our grand adventure. In retrospect, it was a stupid and horrible idea, but what's an 11-year-old kid to do? I blindly trusted my parents and all adults around me, so even through many tears, I went along with it. Josie had already missed her own ship by this point, so she joined me in the search for a ride to the next port. It was actually her who spotted two employees from another cruise line standing near the docking ramp for their ship. Josie ran up to greet them. They were much more pale in comparison to some other cruise staff I'd met by that point, and their demeanor was, strange to say the least, unfriendly. Looking back, they were tightly wound and formal, much like a soldier or maybe a cop. Their lightly colored polos and shorts did little to distract from the distant look in their eyes. Even at 11, I still somehow caught that look. At first, they seemed apprehensive. One of them claimed that their ship wasn't currently passenger ready and they were participating in a test run. The other interjected, No. We have some passengers, but we aren't officially running." Both of them had Midwestern American accents and talked quietly amongst themselves before the second stepped off to the side to have a hushed conversation on his walkie. After a minute, the conversation ended and he returned with the news that we'd be allowed onto the ship. The second claimed that their ship's captain had spoken with mine and cleared it. I had no clear reason at that moment to be apprehensive, and yet something felt wrong. Perhaps it was intuition, or maybe it was just my 11-year-old mind becoming overwhelmed by the situation, but I temporarily shut down. Slammed my little butt down on the ground and cried, "Nope." I kept exclaiming, "I don't care if they have to turn the whole stupid boat around." The men seemed irritated with me, but not Josie. Instead, she knelt down to comfort me and offered to stay with me the entire way. I agreed. We quickly were ushered on board a cruise ship that, to me, looked just about the same as any other I'd seen. As we embarked, the men explained that there was a storm advisory in effect. Therefore, we'd have to stay in our cabin. Dinner would be delivered to our door before bed and we'd port in the morning. Satisfying enough for both myself and Josie, we hung out for hours. Chatting, her about her life as a young adult. Mine, a tag-along only child careening towards puberty in a mere matter of years. It was easy to open up to Josie. After dinner, the two of us quickly became tired. I dozed off and I can't imagine Josie was far behind. The sleepiness had hit so hard that it took a good amount of someone shaking me to actually wake me up. The room was dark and the sky outside did nothing to lessen the darkness. I felt drowsy and almost sedated. Even having only known each other for a couple hours, I recognized Josie's voice in the dark. Something's wrong. She was certainly right, too. Something was wrong. Despite the darkness that prevented any light from coming through and the storm advisory we'd been warned of, the night was silent. The ship was surprisingly stagnant without a single wave to crash against its sides. Josie asked me to grab her hand and after a moment of feeling around in the dark, I found it and did so. She led me over to the window and moved the curtain. The night was silent and the ocean was somehow completely still. A once starry and clear night was somehow black and yet cloudless. No moon stood in the sky, though somehow I could tell you without a shadow of a doubt that it was empty. Empty. The sky was truly just empty. The ship didn't move an inch, not even swaying against the water. And then, an ear-piercing shriek shot through the night like a bolt of lightning. There, and then gone in an instant. There still wasn't enough light for either of us to see each other and yet I felt her terrified gaze as she gripped my little hand harder. I squeezed back, an attempt at solidarity in a situation that was not solid. Scary and shifty as the water should have been. Only a few moments later did the second sound come. It was another screech, this time tritonal with high and low octaves which caused us both to recoil in pain. I couldn't in a million years explain exactly why our bodies do things like this, but I suddenly felt myself moving for the door. Still holding Josie's hand, I rushed out into the dimly lit hallway. "What are you doing? Slow down," she called to no avail. I hit the outer doors and it was like being hit with a brand new level of gravity. Heavy, but only just noticeably more so than normal that it'd be unnerving. It was the same darkness we'd seen from the window. It was present, in your face, and foreboding, hiding almost all but the now muffled sounds of shrieks that were somehow louder inside. Now, you'd think by this point that Josie would be dragging me back into the cabin. There was something in that presence though that instead, also pulled her towards the now muffled sounds that rung on and off throughout the ship. We were quickly standing in front of a door marked personnel only and quickly pushed past that warning. From there on, we wandered through corridors that were dimly lit and yet somehow brighter than the light outside. Pipes ran along each wall which sound constantly reverberated off of. Twisting, turning, and eventually descending into a wide corridor that ended in double doors with two vertical rectangular windows. "Hang back for a second," Josie whispered, letting go of my hand and cautiously approaching the window, doing her best not to be seen. She let out a quick gasp before stifling it with her hand. I quietly crept over as well, the bottom of the window just barely low enough to reach on my tiptoes. The room inside was large with bare metal walls lined with similar pipes to those in the corridor just outside. In a few of the corners, tons of different clothing sat in piles. I noticed that there were uniforms for a few different cruise lines here and there. There were several large metal drains in the floor as well as another double door on the left side of the room, but what dominated the entire space was what appeared to be a large cage that sat on the far wall. A very, very large cage. It seemed hastily made, in retrospect. Possibly from several shipping containers and some spare steel. Huge and looming nonetheless. Inside, it looked dark. Gravely dark like the atmosphere outside the ship. I felt my body begin to sweat and tremble. Josie didn't move. Two men in protective medical gear and gas masks entered from the other door with an older man dressed in khaki shorts, flip-flops, and a patterned button-up and top. He seemed to be in a very sedated state, the poor guy was barely able to stand on his own. One of the gas mask men held the man steady while the other stripped him of his clothing until he was completely nude. They both let the man go after that and gave him a slight nudge toward the cage. He stumbled and eventually fell forwards maybe 2 or 3 feet from the makeshift bars. For a moment, nothing happened. The man moved a bit and tried without much success to at least get up to his knees before he collapsed onto the floor again. The two gas mask men took several steps back and I saw some form of movement inside the cage. A small, pale hand gripped one of the bars. Then, another hand. And another, and another, and another. More began to reach out and I started to notice that not all of them were normal. Some were severely deformed, severed, or disgustingly decayed. There were arms that were far too large to belong to a human being and other appendages that were certainly limbs but not of anything known to man. The darkness within the container had somewhat subsided and I could see now that an incredible mess of horrible flesh had pressed itself against the bars. The arms, now dozens and dozens in number, stretched unnaturally, gripped the man tight and lifted him into the air. It held him there for a second until, even sedated, the man let out a scream that is forever imprinted in some of my worst nightmares. The arms pulled the man with such force into the cage's bars, more importantly into itself, that his body completely broke apart. Blood exploded out into the room for only a moment before the blob's dark gravity pulled it back in. It seemed then that the entire room started to vibrate as the gore seeped into the blob. Afterward, it retreated into the darkness again and for a moment, everything was still. With the horror in front of me, I hadn't been watching the gas mask men but in the few moments that passed, one had produced a clipboard and was writing furiously. The other had his hands over his ears. He still looked at the cage, the bars now seeming way too wide to me. Not secure enough. Not safe. My 11-year-old brain began to process the situation and my body trembled harder. I wanted to grab Josie. I wanted us to run. The sound that came from somewhere inside the cage, that same tritonal horrible screech from earlier, stopped me dead in my tracks. It was as if the thing was unleashing 1,000 horrified death wails all at once and being that close to it was not just painful, but nauseating and dizzying as well. My vision began to tunnel out. It seemed that Josie was suffering from the same issue and her knees buckled. She tried to brace herself against the door thinking it was latched but it clearly didn't have one as it easily swung open into the death chamber of a room. There was a second of stillness and shock as the door swung forward and eventually back. The gas-masked men stared at Josie and I as she tried desperately to get back to her feet. She grabbed my wrist almost too tight as the men realized what had happened and began to give chase. My ears rang and my vision was still coming back as we passed through corridor after corridor. She was surprisingly fast and I was grateful when the outer door eventually came into view. The atmosphere outside was much less imposing than before. The water seemed more natural and there were even some visible stars in the sky. Those factors didn't change the sound of impending footfalls constantly behind us as we ran along the deck. Once we reached a dead end, I looked back and noticed the men had taken off their gas masks, revealing the faces of same men that offered us a ride at the port. Josie looked around in desperation for a moment as they quickly approached before grabbing a wooden deck chair and throwing it overboard. She then did the unthinkable. Still gripping my wrist, she dragged me to the edge and with one swift movement, she threw me over. As I fell, I saw her try to climb over the edge and almost succeed before being yanked back on board. After that, I hit the water hard and it rocked my tiny body enough to knock me completely unconscious. I still don't know how I survived, I just know that I was found 3 days after I'd gone missing from the port. Yeah. Missing. The gas-masked men and their captain had never actually contacted our cruise ship. Mom and Dad had no idea that I had even left port. They flew back to look for me after they'd arrived at their next stop and still hadn't heard from me. A family on a year-long leisure trip on their small boat had stumbled across me, unconscious atop a broken deck chair. Strangely enough, multiple doctors were insistent that I had only been out in the water for 12 to 24 hours, despite the days unaccounted for. Ultimately, I was properly catatonic the first few days afterwards and the story I eventually told, the very story I've just shared with you, was said to be the imaginative work of a traumatized child. I suppose that very real trauma that gratefully discouraged my parents from ever even bringing up cruise trips again, was the ultimate reason that I forgot everything for years afterwards. Well, almost everything. The name Josie stayed with me my entire childhood. I was obsessed and didn't really know why. I named our family dog Josie. I named my dolls Josie. When my parents eventually relented on their TV and video game hatred, if I could pick a character's name. Josie. Always. As I got older, things came back here and there, but it wasn't until young adulthood that a strange coincidence brought it all back, hitting hard like ocean waves. My then fiancé, current ex-husband, and I were on a road trip, a far superior mode of travel for vacation in my opinion, and we'd stopped at a little mom-and-pop grocery store along the west coast. The man who owned the shop, a kindly older gentleman, ran the cash register while his wife stocked shelves. He began checking us out as he chit-chatted with my fiancé about our travels. I, however, paid little attention as my eyes landed and locked on an older photo of a young girl that sat on the inner counter, next to the register. She seemed so familiar in a way that made me feel suddenly seasick. The older man noticed immediately and grabbed the photo. "Ah, yeah. That's our daughter. It wasn't a big case but we tried our hardest to get her found. I keep this here so she's always with us." His voice didn't waver, it was clear he'd talked about it a lot over years of friendly conversation with customers. She loved the ocean so much and worked for that damned cruise line every single summer. By then, the wife had wandered from her work and joined in on the conversation, first scolding her husband for cursing in front of customers and then talking a little more about her daughter. How she'd left for the summer and had never come back. How she'd been likely lost at sea somehow. It was all starting to come back to me when my fiancé said, "Aw, she sounds like she was amazing. What was her name?" I think this is when the old couple got a little emotional. The woman turned her gaze away for a moment before the man rested his hand on her shoulder in an effort to comfort her. "Her name was Josephine, but she always went by Josie,"